All right, hello everybody. This is Jillian Carter. Me and Madison did a presentation on the Amazing Grace by Jonathan Kazol. In this presentation, we will be talking about the overall chapters of the book as well as the implications and impacts of the novel.
So, Jonathan Kozol's purpose for having his discussions with students and others within the community. So, he visited the South Bronx, which is the poorest urban community in the United States, and he did so to talk with children about their experiences within their communities. He also talked with teachers and other highly respected individuals, such as ministers within the community, about their perspectives on the poverty and social injustices that individuals in the community face on the daily. And he truly wanted to bring a light that despite their struggles, students in this community have faith in human decency and hope for improvement.
Okay, in chapter one, the book discusses wealth gap and racial segregation. So the book starts off talking about the population and breakdown of Mott Haven, which is a community in the South Bronx. So two-thirds are Hispanic and one-third is Black. Um, this connects to systemic racism. So systemic racism is the idea that majority groups put structures in place to keep power over minority groups. Implications for teaching. As educators, obviously, we cannot tackle the full problem of systemic racism head on, but we can help within our own classrooms by empowering students of color to learn by incorporating culturally relevant material into our lessons. So, incorporating student interests will help students to be engaged in education and perform with better outcomes.
So, throughout the second chapter, conversations mainly focused on the unsafe living conditions that individuals within this community face. There was a lot of talk about how a lot of buildings are locked up and abandoned. There aren't really educational or recreational opportunities for children or adults within the community. No one really wanting to talk about racism or the injustices that the community faces and their struggles with inequalities in healthcare and the welfare system. So in incorporating culture and diversity in the classroom, it's important for students to identify outside of the classroom in order for them to incorporate their experiences within their education. And this can keep them engaged and interested in the material that they're learning and building upon that knowledge. And utilizing a culturally sustaining pedagogy within the teaching to your students really allows them to hone in on their culture and incorporating that so that they can reflect what they experience into their learning and see how it is relevant to their experiences they face every day. And then because of the distrust and unsafe conditions that they do have in their communities, it's really important to create a safe and welcoming classroom environment. These environments that they're in are often discriminatory, unsafe, and they create a sense of hopelessness in students to succeed. So, really focusing on how you can make students feel safe and welcome in their classroom despite anything they might be facing outside of it really allows them to forget the outside world for a little bit and really just focus on their learning and what is important so that they can reach those further levels of succeeding and making a life for themselves to reach that hopefulness that they have for change in their community.
Okay. In chapter three, they talk about health issues and food insecurities among the members of Mott Haven. So some of the health issues they talk about is drug culture and violence within these communities. And they talk about the cycle of poverty and systemic racism with talking about babies being born addicted to drugs and how it's hard to stop the cycle, obviously, when children are already disadvantaged before they are even born. Um, And then with food insecurities, they talk about how the government subsidizes food to provide for the people in the community, but it's never enough food, and so people don't have enough money to provide for their families, and so they go hungry. These types of issues relate to stress-related behaviors within classrooms. So research has shown that um, these stressors can cause effects in the brain, such as loss of gray matter, which affects social behavior and decision making, as well as loss of white matter, which is connected to the prefrontal cortex and the oblongata, which reduces self control.
Throughout chapter 4, Kozel is discussing with different adults and students in the community about public services that are losing funding and the programs are just kind of being eliminated from their community as a whole, as well as deaths within the community by fires from their poor living conditions, gun violence, and other sorts of gang related activity. So it is really important within the classroom to build trust with among your students and with adults within the school. Showing them that they do have trustworthy adults within their community can encourage their willingness to learn, and they can build connections in order for them to utilize mentors not only within the school but even outside of the school to find those positive connections and get out of those gang related activities. It's also important for teachers and schools to provide resources for services outside of the classroom. Those who are in poverty often lack the resources that are necessary to meet their basic needs. So, as mentioned, their healthcare was dwindling. So, trying to provide those resources when they are available, providing food by donations or other sources of funding, trying to work with the community and finding them adequate housing, giving them sufficient clothing and basic supplies that they may need for school, since those are things that they can worry about and often in certain situations can be made fun of or cause other social issues for them. Making sure that these basic needs are met really allow these students to not have to focus on those basic needs and those stressors and trying to figure out where their next meal will come from or if they're safe when they're home, so they can truly focus on their academics and learning and just putting themselves in the forefront. It's also important to create opportunities for positive peer engagement, since gang life is all too familiar for these students within the community. Building those opportunities for positive peer engagement through different clubs in school or even just within the classroom, as well as extracurricular activities, shows them the importance of working together and not against one another. It promotes them being able to find similarities among themselves within the community, even though they're already facing these injustices that they have in common. These gang related activities can often pit people against each other and really try to focus on the differences that everyone has, even though they're facing many of the same disadvantages. So, creating these opportunities for students really allows them to build those relationships with others and have that bleed into the classroom.
Okay, chapter 5 talks about the loss of young people within this community. So they make an analogy between the effects of AIDS and drug overdose on young people to the effects of the Black Plague. And then another epidemic they talk about is the epidemic of incarceration. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, Black people are 6 times more likely than white people to be incarcerated. Um, and this can connect to racial bias. So, racial bias is a prejudice where you believe that members of a certain racial group have distinctive categories, and that is usually has a negative connotation to them. So obviously, when we are teaching, we need to be aware of implicit and explicit biases that affect how we treat students of color. Going along with that, we uh, need to create a positive mindset for these students by creating a community where all are welcome.
So, in chapter 6, It's kind of wrapping up his discussions with a lot of the individuals that he was talking with. And it was a highlighted point within this chapter that no one really wants to discuss the injustices that these lower income neighborhoods face, and they only want to focus on the positives. It's also mentioned that poor people of color are portrayed as sincere human beings rather than being insincere ones or think people that you should be scared of. It specifically has a conversation with one white woman within the community and how she is scared of the poor in the community, but it's more that they are sincere human beings and they do want to get more, they just can't access it. They also talk a lot about how money is more important to the wealthy than relationships are. They're more willing to write checks or just donate money in certain areas where they think that is important. In terms of the classroom and teaching, it is extremely important to have connection and relationships with your students, since many students of color in these poor communities don't have peer relationships or relationships with adults outside of school due to being viewed as less than or being insincere. It's also important to foster parental involvement in the classroom and in their students' education, since families already lack a sufficient amount of support from their community and the leaders that make decisions for their community. Providing parents and families with the support and showing the importance that they have within their child's learning is key. This affects not only the family and how things might be going at home, but it also blends into the student in that classroom and just their overall outlook on learning and how they should be within the school setting. It's also extremely important to discuss the injustices within the community, since those wealthy and pouring money into certain things where they might not be as important as they seem. Building those relationships and understanding what is important to them not only allows them to see those injustices and where things need improvement so they can speak for themselves, but it also allows for you as a teacher and a school as a whole to really advocate for your students and their community and what they need to be able to get into a better situation so they can truly focus on their schooling and what is important. So for strategies for creating a culturally responsive classroom, this is not the entire list. There are definitely more, but these are some that I found to be extremely important. And this includes making learning contextual, creating a safe and welcoming learning environment, fostering relationships with students, incorporating culture into lessons, discussing social injustices within the community and the society as a whole, setting high expectations for your students. They are already believed that they may not be capable of much or can succeed within their education and are just falling into a cycle. So, really focusing on what they can do and what you believe they are capable of allows them to strive towards that and gives them someone to kind of look up to that they believe in them. Promoting reading is huge, since this community tends to have a lower level of literacy skills. Creating a student-centered classroom to real-life connections, encouraging group interaction, validating multiple perspectives, fostering student interests, and utilizing culturally sustaining pedagogy.
Okay, so impact of the novel. So for the impact, I decided to go out to the government level. Um, so I listed some ways that the government um has shown to tackle the problems of social inequality and systemic racism. So these are directly from the White House website. So one thing that they implemented is creating a chief officer of diversity and inclusion. So their job is to advance policy that considers diversity and inclusion, which obviously that makes sense considering that their title, which though that seems that is up at the federal level, hopefully it can trickle down into the local level as well. And then Biden passed Executive Order 13985, which establishes that the federal government's role in advancing equity and creating opportunities for historically disadvantaged communities. And then lastly, um, action has been taken by the the U.S. Human Rights Council. So 140 nations got together to create calls for action for all nations, um, so that all nations could acknowledge the persistence of systemic racism, considering inclusivity in decision making and addressing inequalities in policy. So here we have an engagement activity. So this is the YouTube video is just a short clip about equality and fairness, and the questions go along with the video. So you can take time to answer those on your own. And then here are the references and sources for our presentation.